听专家解读美国升学方案，看美国学习生活点滴，圆美国名校梦想。本节目由美国文美教育集团冠名播出。
大家好，欢迎收看文美集团美国升学直通车。文美集团美国升学直通车是华人网和文美教育集团联合制作播出的北美首档大型的网络直播教育节目。在我们的节目当中，你将会了解到最新最权威的教育资讯，还有升学的建议。无论你是学生还是家长，有任何的美国升学教育问题，都可以给我们留言。首先来介绍一下文美集团。美国文美集团，美国大学申请规划服务第一品牌，20年经验，万博士领衔常春藤顾问团队，中美双顾问模式，服务一个学生，按照大学录取学校排名收费，与孩子形成利益共同体。华人老品牌，值得您的信赖。文美集团隆重推出 ACAP 大学专业及职业测评规划管理系统，华人升学机构首创，完美解决华人学生最大升学痛点。人工智能提前锁定大学专业方向，提前2到5年布局申请。有了专业测评系统，孩子的课程规划更清晰，活动更聚焦，文书更有故事感，大学申请更有竞争力。5到11年级学生都可以报名参加测评。文美集团1对1非营利组织成立运营领导力项目，让孩子从参与者变为领导者，真正成长、成人、成才，进名校。5到11年级学生均可报名参加。文美集团社会影响力联合国网络义工课程，节省孩子时间，做名校认可的社会影响力，高大上义工。5到11年级学生均可报名参加。今天我们邀请到前康奈尔大学的面试官，同时也是文美集团的顾问 Mr. Pierre 先生，和我们来深度解析2026年到2027年美国 Top 20大学的录取趋势。有请 Mr. Pierre。
Hi, this is Pierre Rodriguez for WinMay. I'm an admissions counselor as well as an SAT prep tutor. This video presentation will discuss the topic of admissions trends at top 20 universities for the cycle of 2026 to 2027 and on. So I'd like to start out by saying that the latest admissions data show that getting into the most prestigious colleges is harder than ever. So I wanted to start by establishing that sense of urgency. Acceptance rates at Harvard, Stanford, MIT, and other Ivy League peers have plunged to record lows. Even as colleges admit more students from diverse and underrepresented backgrounds, in this presentation, we're going to explore why college admissions have become so competitive, what new patterns are emerging, and even a few insider secrets that are not widely publicized. Our goal is to help you understand how the landscape is shifting from what it was and how students can do different things to adapt and respond better. So the first topic under this section is going to be skyrocketing selectivity. So record low acceptance rates. Top schools are admitting smaller and smaller percentages of applicants. For example, Harvard this year it just admitted 3.19% of its class 2026 applicants, which is officially the lowest in its history. Similarly, Columbia reported a 3.73 admit rate for its class of 2026. Yale's overall rate for the class of 2030 was 4.24%, which is down from 4.75 the previous year. These are dramatic drops from just a few years ago. For instance, Harvard had an admissions rate of 5.2% for the class of 2018. The next topic would be growing applicant pools. So these low rates are driven by record numbers of applications. Harvard saw its application pool reach a new high in 2022, contributing to that 3.19% admit rate. So essentially more and more students are applying. So essentially what you can think about is that it's more competitive. There's more competition, more people that you have to beat out for the same number of seats. Stanford, Yale, MIT, and others also report historically large applicant pools. Easier online applications, for instance, the Common App, more students applying to many schools at once. For instance, I've seen many videos on YouTube where students literally apply and make decision videos for content, whether they have a realistic chance of applying or not. Sometimes it's not even important. It's just for the content. And so you'll have students applying to colleges where it's practically a reach school in a high number. So like a high number of reach schools, but simply so that they can make a reaction video. So that's going to be a small percentage that explains everything. But the idea is that students will see these videos and then also imagine that they should also be taking, a bigger shot and apply to a wider number, a range of schools. So, and then the other point to follow up would be that rising interest has also been coming from international and underrepresented students. So that has all increased the demand from them. As for Ivy League and peer schools, every Ivy League school now has an admit rate in the single digits. Stanford's recent common data set showed an overall admit rate around 4%, with approximately an SAT score of 1540 for those submitting. MIT's combined admit rate for the class of 2029 was roughly 4.5%. That is 1,324 admits out of 29,282 applicants. Even traditionally, less selective schools like Cornell have dropped into the 5 to 10% range. In short, among the top 20 universities, acceptance rates is now extremely rare. So now we're going to talk about why competition has grown to understand that better. Several factors explain the rising competition. More applicants per student. It's common now for high-achieving students to apply to 10 to 20 colleges. This is something that I alluded to earlier. Schools report many applicants submitting multiple early/regular applications. Since most applicants are high achievers, rising application counts don't mean weaker applicants. Rather, top schools are selecting from a much larger pool of equally qualified candidates. So in other words, the most competitive students are now realizing that it comes down to just paying for an additional application. So in other words, the difference between applying to 10 colleges versus 15 is simply going to be the additional cost of those 5 applications, as well as possibly a few more essays, which usually is pretty standard for competitive schools. In other words, they have their own essays that you need to respond to. The other interesting factor is the pandemic effects. So beyond being a shock to the world in terms of the healthcare system and overall health, COVID-19 also affected admissions. So during COVID, as you know, many schools went test optional and students applied safely to reach schools, swelling applicant numbers. And the logic there is that because SAT and ACT were now optional, students that maybe had weaker scores in that area could now apply without having to include their scores. So that meant that whereas before they would have to include the score and possibly be at a disadvantage compared to other more competitive students, now they could just do away with that and not include it at all. So what you saw was more and more students applying to schools that they would otherwise not apply to, simply because of the change in testing policy. Now, even as some universities return to requiring tests, as we'll talk about soon, many students still apply widely, keeping volumes high. In other words, we see like a residual effect that has been left over from the pandemic. So in other words, even though schools are requiring SATs now and ACTs, some students are still adopting that mindset of applying as test optional. Granted, the school has that policy. Another factor would be financial aid and diversity initiatives. Generous financial aid and outreach programs at elite universities have attracted more qualified students who might previously have ruled out those schools. For instance, Harvard's new policy covers full costs for families under $75,000. And Princeton and Stanford similarly expanded aid. This has encouraged more low and middle income students, many first generation or Pell eligible, which is the Pell Grant, to apply, broadening the applicant pool. So as financial aid has expanded and become more accommodating, more students that otherwise would not be able to afford going to those prestigious universities because of the cost will now be in a position to apply. And so you see more of them applying. Lastly, we have media exposure. Stories about surging admissions difficulty tend to attract more applicants. Everyone's applying to Ivies now. In other words, FOMO, the fear of being left out, fear of missing out. So in other words, since you hear that students are applying, in larger numbers, you say to yourself, well, I'm also going to take my shot. I might as well. While that pandemic narrative isn't necessarily helpful, it's true that competitive schools have become highly visible targets. So the bottom line here is that applicants face a supply and demand squeeze. Colleges may not be harder academically than before, but there are far more qualified applicants per seat. This means even students with stellar credentials can't count on admit rates as safety metrics. Instead, focus on presenting the strongest possible application, whether that's grades, the rigor of your courses, essay, or character.